Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of Sheikh Hassa, the Director General of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, I welcome you to the first lecture of the 28th season, cultural season. Unfortunately, Sheikh Hassa will not be here tonight. She asked me to apologize on her behalf for not being able to come because a very close gentleman, a relative of hers, passed away this morning, Sheikh Mubarak Abdullah Ahmed. And she said, as much as she wanted to and she was prepared for it, to come and welcome you tonight, unfortunately, she couldn't make it. So she asked me to apologize on her behalf for not being able to come. But she insisted on continuing with the program. And therefore, we welcome our dear friend, Dr. Ziad Rajab, to the lecture series. Although the lecture series is the core of our cultural seasons, our other activities have blossomed to comprise much more for each season. And this year is no exception. If you look at our brochures, you will find musical events, children programs, art workshops, exhibitions, and much more. At this point, I should remind you that if you have not renewed your membership, to do so. Tonight's talk, the Tariq Sayyid Rajab Museum lecture, is a commemoration of that museum's involvement with the Dar, especially by helping to revive our lecture series, by their curator delivering lectures on various aspects of their extensive collection. After their curator passed away, Dr. Ziad Rajab took over and has continued taking us on a virtual tour of that, focuses on specific objects on the area of their extensive collection. Dr. Ziad is the son of the founders of both the museum and the New English School, and he is now a board member of the museum and manager of the New English School. This evening, Dr. Ziad, where is it? There you go. Dr. Ziad will be discussing silk in the Islamic world with examples from the Tariq Rajab Museum. 3 weeks ago, Dr. Ziad went to Singapore for treatment. Didn't work out, did it? He's still extremely sensitive and allergic to noises from mobile phones. So be kind, turn them off, and let's welcome Dr. Ziad.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight. It's nice to see, well, I can't see you, you can see me. I can see many familiar faces, which is quite comforting, because it's quite daunting standing here in front of a big crowd. And I'm very sorry that Sheikh Hassa, of course, couldn't come this evening, because I wanted to thank her, as I do every year, for inviting us to give this first talk of the lecture season. And congratulations, you are the representative, Mr. Al-Bayjan, on your 28th season. And just one little correction, I'm not actually a curator. I'm just an investigator, along with other family members, who are, like my sister and other family members of ours. So I wouldn't actually be so grand as to call myself a curator, much as it's nice to be one. So every year, I try to find something, one aspect of the museum that I could investigate, because for me it's a learning process too, and I usually have a discussion with my sister about this, and we come up with many ideas. And we thought perhaps this year a part of the museum which is actually hidden away, because we have quite a large collection of textiles and costumes in the museum which are basically not on display for various reasons, one being that we don't have the space. So if anybody would like to offer us space, perhaps we could exhibit some of our things. But apart from space, of course, exposing costumes to too much light and to the elements, basically, is not, you'd have to rotate them. Costumes are quite sensitive, and a lot of these are over 200 years old, so they're kept in storage. So, and to narrow it down, as we've got well over 1,000 items or costumes in the textile section, I thought silk. Silk is such an important subject in the history between the Far East, the Middle East, and Europe that it would make for a very interesting topic. So normally what I do is I give a little bit of background on the subject and then talk about the objects we have in the museum. This morning I was sitting in my office and I thought, every year I take you through, like last year, a little bit of the history of glassmaking in the Middle East and in the wider Islamic world, and I end up with 10 minutes to rush through the objects in our museum, and some of them I don't even manage to really cover. And so I thought what I should have done this year is I should have planned backwards. I should show you our objects, spend 30 minutes on that, and then rush you through the background. Maybe in the future, because I didn't prepare for that. And so, this evening, our subject, silk. There's a nice curtain there done. A silk curtain. This piece is actually a Moroccan brocade, a silk one, which came from the inside of a tent, a 19th century piece, which is actually on display in the museum now. So, silk. Silk's been treasured and used throughout history, and there's evidence of silk threads in Chinese tombs dating as far back as 8,000 years. And the earliest known example of a silk fabric made of silk was found in a tomb in China, in this urn actually, and this dates back 5,500 years, and inside it was this carbonized fabric which, after analysis, was found to be silk and used as a wrap for a child's body. And there was another find in China, and it was mentioned in many, many sources, and I couldn't find a picture of it at all, which is of a little ivory cup carved with a silkworm on it, thought to be between 6,000 and 7,000 years old, excavated with spinning tools and along the lower Yangtze River. So actually silk could be much older than is presently accepted. And silk was of such value and important that the trade routes between China and the regions to the west of China, extending through Central Asia, the Middle East, and finally Europe, was called the Silk Road, which is shown here in this nice map. And this is a term coined by a German traveler, Ferdinand von Richthofen, in 1877 AD. And some people call it the Silk Route. It was at least 6,000 kilometers long, and along its length, in red over there, has sprung, of course, important towns and caravanserai, which were basically inns where people could rest, their animals could rest, they had food, they could store their goods and be protected. And these were all along the route from China all the way to the Middle East. And of course, silk wasn't the only commodity being traded at the time. There were many other things like spices, tea, porcelain, jade, precious stones, and so on from China. And in exchange, China imported horses, textiles, glassware from Syria and Egypt, incense and perfumes from Arabia, and many other things. But silk was one of the products prized a lot above others and was in very high demand even as far as the Roman Empire in the West, where it was used by the elite, basically, the rulers. But what is silk, and why was it and why is it such a highly desirable fabric? I just took these pictures because these are contemporary Syrian silk, which someone recently brought me from Syria. I was going to bring it in today so you could all have a feel, but it would have been difficult to set up. But they still make beautiful silk. Some of these styles they make, like the brocades, are very, very ancient methods of weaving, which unfortunately is a dying craft in Syria today. So why is it so expensive? I mean, to start with, the production of silk is so laborious and expensive, and people are always attracted to expensive items. So today people like their Prada handbag because it gives them a little prestige and it's very expensive. And in the old days, silk was one of the items that could show your status and, people could show off with. And as for what silk is, basically it's a protein fiber which is produced by the larva, a worm, of certain insects and even spiders to make cocoons, such as these. And inside the cocoon, the larvae would incubate, and then they'd eventually should become a silk moth, which is called, the scientific term is Bombyx mori. And you'll hear me refer to later Bombyx mori silk, because there are many, many other types of silk, and spiders too make silk thread, which is much is thinner than a human hair, but much stronger than a single human hair, even though it looks so fragile. So another reason why silk is so beautiful is because the structure within the threads is a prism-like structure, such as shown here, which refracts the light. So white light comes in and colored light comes out, which is why you see silk glistening and gleaming, and gives it a beautiful sheen. But in fact, as I said, it's not only the Bombyx mori silkworm that produces silk threads, but the larvae of beetles and many other creatures, as I said, like spiders. And you can see all the colors reflected through that because of refraction. But the mulberry silkworm produces the most suitable silk the most suitable thread for silk. And the production of silk is called sericulture. And how was silk first discovered? And there are various stories. Of course, it was in China. And one of the stories was that in around 2500 BC, during the reign of the Emperor Huangdi, his wife, Queen Xiling, we were supposed to see that earlier. This is Xiling, was sitting in her garden, sipping tea, admiring her garden, and something fell into her teacup. And she jumped up, and the tea spilt onto her clothes and came apart in threads. And she realized the threads came from a cocoon. That's her husband, the emperor. And so she picked it up, and she realized that these were the most beautiful threads she'd ever seen, and proceeded to weave them and produce silk. And an event which was celebrated with feasting throughout the land. A nice fairy tale. So probably the more reasonable tale is that sericulture was established much earlier than Emperor Huangdi's era and was probably discovered by country people in whatever way. And many families, especially the women folk, were quite expert at the time at rearing silkworms and feeding them with leaves from a mulberry tree. It's the mulberry tree which actually they need to thrive on. And they'd gather cocoons of silk fiber and would then drop them into vats of boiling water, such as can be seen in this picture in Syrian, 19th century, where they're actually steaming the cocoons rather than boiling them. And the reason they boil them or steam them is to kill the larvae inside. Because if they allowed the moth to break out, it would break the threads and you wouldn't get the threads, which are sometimes 500 to 600 meters long. The fibers would then be unwound like that into these very, very, very long yarns. And so the country people would have used the product, the silk material, to pay for their taxes. And in China, taxes have always been very high, so it was quite an important activity. But how long ago the Chinese then began to export their silk is another, uncertain thing. But some sources point out that silk has been known, outside China, so as long ago as the first millennium BC, even mentioned in writings that have something to do with the prophet Ezekiel in the first millennium BC. But what is known is that in 115 BC, the king of Parthia, Mithridates II, at the time, shown here in this coin, had made a trade pact with the Emperor Wuti of China. And commerce between the two empires was facilitated, opening the trade routes for silk as well as other products, all the way to the Middle East, to Egypt, to Rome. And outside of China, of course, people had absolutely no idea how silk was made. And this was evidenced by Pliny the Elder, who in 70 AD wrote that silk was a pale floss growing on leaves. The Romans paid staggering amounts of money for silk in gold and silver, and Pliny estimated the annual sum paid by the Romans for silk was 100 million sesterces, which in today's money is equivalent to $250 million. And in the very early days of its introduction into Rome, the upper class could only afford little brooches of silk which they attached to their clothes. At first, trade was minimal, so in the first century, although by the end of the first century, later on in the first century, Julius Caesar was ordering curtains made of silk, so suddenly it became much more plentiful. And the caravan routes from northern China to the eastern frontier of Persia, which passed through the territories of various Turkic tribes, as you can see around the Taklamakan desert there, became much quieter, and the Roman world suddenly became in a state of peace and prosperity. So trade increased rapidly at this time, so 2,000 years ago, and the quantities of silk reaching the Middle East and then into Rome expanded greatly. And there was so much silk and transparent silk that people started to criticize its use in Rome, including the philosopher Seneca the Younger, who wrote in the 1st century AD about the fashion for wearing transparent silk and stating that it was a cause for adultery in Rome. So people didn't actually, they wanted it, but they criticized it. And but during this early period, Rome, of course, was establishing itself very firmly in the Middle East and maintaining control over all the trade routes. Middle Eastern cities, of course, had a very, very big role in the commerce, including the silk commerce between East and West at the time. And there were mercantile cities such as Palmyra in Syria, which is called Tedmur locally, and Petra, which were the most important, along with some other cities in Mesopotamia. Now, the Emperor Pompeius Magnus annexed Syria in 64 BC. He made it a Roman province, together with Judea. By 105 AD, the Arab kingdoms of Palmyra and Petra were both incorporated into the empire, first as client kingdoms, but later annexed, although in the case of Palmyra, they did retain some degree of independence. Damascus was handed over back and forth to client kingdoms before finally being totally incorporated into the Roman Empire in AD 62. And over this period, the Romans were, of course, building their famous roads all over the Middle East as well as Europe. For the silk trade, well, for commerce in general, this was of strategic importance because along the road they built garrisons and they could protect the caravans going back and forth. And, sorry, that was a picture of Palmyra, amazing city, which I had the good fortune to visit, not since 2011, of course. And these are some of the Roman roads which were built once Palmyra had been incorporated into the empire, and a slightly better map. And so, of course, trade was greatly improved, and silk became more affordable, not only for the ruling class, but for other people as well. Before the Romans took over, there is evidence, of course, that Palmyra in Syria was already a very important trade link in the Silk Route. And a lot of the silk destined for Rome came through Palmyra. And people have done studies there, and they found silk funerary wrappings in the tombs of the wealthy citizens of Palmyra, in the famous tower tombs, in fact. And these tower tombs date from before the Roman annexation. So some scholars, so annexation was a little bit later, and the style of tombs in Palmyra changed and became more Roman. This was unique to Palmyra. So some scholars, including a lady called Cynthia Finlayson, studied the fabrics that they found in the tombs and the motifs in them, and she was using that to explain how they were already weaving, not producing silk, but weaving their own silk textiles in Palmyra before the Romans appeared on the scene. A key figure in Palmyra, of course, was, I'm sure you all know, Queen Zenobia, the widow of King Odenathus, shown here in this statue, whose name in Arabic, incidentally, is Udayna. And Queen Zenobia became, she became queen when Odenathus died, and she took a very, very, very active role in the running of the kingdom and in maintaining the commerce and improving commerce. She also then wanted complete independence from Rome, defied them, fought battles against them before finally being defeated by the Emperor Aurelian in 273 AD, and she was taken to Rome in chains, much as Queen Cleopatra of Egypt was. And her kingdom, of course, was in control of all the silk coming through that region. And as I said, Cynthia Finlayson, a researcher in Palmyra, studied the textiles, which she found, as well as the statues. So the women of Palmyra, as shown here, would wear silken headdresses, which were found in the tombs. And they had, in the headdresses, they had family or clan motifs, which were passed down through the female line. Females played quite a prominent role in Palmyra. And so she deduced that because these fabrics had their specific family motifs, these were made locally. And so I think we have another. That's some of that pre-Roman Palmyran silk with some of those motifs I mentioned. So while silk was being imported into the Middle East and the Roman Empire from as early as the 1st century BC, determining when it actually was produced is another matter yet again. And there are mentions in a Chinese book dating to the 1st century AD called the Book of the Later Han Dynasty. And this book mentions a kind of silk called the down of a water sheep. And they report that this silk is made of cocoons of wild silk, which was very, very sought after in China itself. And this silk came from the West, meaning from Syria, to be specific. And there is, however, no historic evidence whatsoever that the silk of the Bombyx Mori was made in this region at the time. And the most likely explanation is that the silk was of two different types. So firstly, the Phoenicians, the contemporary inhabitants along the Syrian coast, as well as other peoples in the Eastern Mediterranean, were making a type of silk called sea silk, which was very, very valuable, very, very fine, also called byssus silk. Some of you might have heard of it, of course. And at the time, it was a fabric even more precious than Bombyx Mori silk. And this silk thread is the oldest that is referred to as silk woven in Syria and Lebanon, and traces of it more than 2,000 years old have been excavated. Now, what is a byssus? A byssus is a long strand or a filament secreted by shells, mollusk shells like this. And these secretions are in order to attach themselves to the ground. And these fibers can grow up to 30 centimeters long, 1 foot. And for thousands of years, the inhabitants have been taking these strands, weaving them into fine fabrics, which were amongst the most valuable, as I mentioned. It was very desired because it was very light in weight, and it shone when exposed to the sun like this, once it had been treated with various things, spices, lemon juice, and exposure. And then it could be woven. It's referred to in Greek and Roman records, and cloaks of byssus were often worn by Roman emperors or presented to foreign rulers by the emperor. Most often in history, it was restricted to the ruling class or very high-ranking court officials. It was known in Arabia too, where it was called Suf al-Bahar, which means the wool of the sea. And some historians, such as the noted historian al-Islamiyyah, mentioned that a robe of seawool cost over 1,000 dinars, which at the time was a huge fortune. And the Chinese themselves, they treasured this silk and imported it into China, and they called it Egyptian silk or mermaid silk. I'm going to show you a robe, this one, which is called the Chasuble of St. Yves of Louannec, which was actually woven in Sicily when it was under Arab rule, but ended up as an ecclesiastical garment, so it went into the Christian church in Europe. And it's been known for hundreds of years as a byssus silk robe. Unfortunately, very recent analysis has proved that it's actually just silk with gold thread, which is a shame. It was nice to think of as byssus silk. It's interesting to mention that byssus silk has been woven until recently, but unfortunately there's only one woman left in Sardinia who actually carries on this craft. And very recently in New York, at an auction, there was a rare sea silk hat, this one, which was sold for $15,000, a contemporary hat, still precious. There was also another type of silk which the Chinese wanted that came from Syria. And this silk was lighter, it was more transparent and gauzy than the heavier type that came out of China. So it was more like this. The Chinese were completely unaware that they were actually buying back their own silk. So in the weaving centers of Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Syrian cities, the weavers were unraveling the Chinese silk that had been imported and then reweaving it into lighter fabrics and sending it back to China. And they were also selling it to Rome, of course, where it was quite appreciated. The intermediaries at the time were the Parthians in present-day Iran. And they were keeping this a big secret from the Chinese, and they led them to believe that this was a special silk produced by silkworms in Syria. Scholars in China have, of course, done many, many studies on silk. And one scholar called Gang Yu mentions a book called The Records of the Three Kingdoms, written in China in the 3rd century AD, in which it states that the people of Syria bred their own silkworms. But he mentions that Syrians, and in effect the Romans, desperately wanted silk from China, and that the silkworms used to make the local silk was not from the Bombyx mori, mulberry silkworm, but from wild worms. So they were wrong on all counts. The fact is, the production of silk remained a closely guarded secret and a Chinese monopoly for thousands of years, 3,000 at least, until the turn of the first millennium, when the secret first infiltrated eastwards towards Korea and Japan, and then westwards to Central Asia, Persia, India, the Levant. And there are quite a few stories about how silk arrived in other parts of the world. So with regard to the Byzantine Empire, some writers claim that the production of silk started in the 6th century. There is evidence for that. And a Byzantine historian, Procopius, stated that in 550 AD, the Emperor Justinian, shown here, wanted to circumvent the Parthians, who were taxing, of course, the silk, as they controlled the trade between China and the West. And he ordered that 2 monks who had traveled east must first find out the secret of silk making. And he commissioned them, basically. And these were actually Nestorian monks, and the Nestorians were a Christian sect all around the Middle East at the time, Mesopotamia, the Gulf even. There's a Nestorian church which was discovered on Failaka Island. They were in Persia, and they were as far as China, and they still have relics in China. So they managed to smuggle silkworms, silkworm eggs, and mulberry seeds into Constantinople, the capital of the empire. Once established in Constantinople, within 10 years, the imperial court of the Byzantines had a monopoly over the production of silk, as well as its weaving. And this subsequently caused mass unemployment in Syria and Lebanon, which were major weaving centers at the time, as they monopolized and took all the weaving into Constantinople for some time. The empire became famous for magnificent silk textiles and embroideries, which were used throughout medieval Europe for royal and for ecclesiastical garments and furnishings. So here's an example, which is the shroud of Charlemagne. And he was buried in this shroud in 814 AD. It's Byzantine silk, but dyed with Tyrian purple. And Tyrian purple is a kind of dye extracted from a shell in Lebanon, the Syrian coast as well. And so they did make big quantities of silk, but they couldn't meet the local demand, so they were still importing from China. And then you have the story of smuggling silkworms, another story out of China set in the 5th century AD, and this is about a Chinese princess who was betrothed to a king in Khotan, which is in Central Asia. Encouraged by the king, when she came to Khotan, she smuggled some eggs and mulberry seeds out of China, which incidentally was a crime punishable by death at the time. She hid them in her elaborate headdress. And so there's a panel excavated in the 7th century in Khotan. It was excavated, it's a 7th century panel, which depicts the princess sitting there in the middle, and her attendant is pointing to her headdress, supposedly indicating the hidden silkworms. There's what's thought to be the god of silk sitting at the back, holding a shuttle to do the weaving. And then the lady to the right is holding some cocoons. And this is another theory about how silk escaped China. And there are also records that suggest that the kingdoms at the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, including the fascinating Tang client kingdoms of Kucha and Kara Shahr, seen there at the top, and there's Khotan on the bottom there, were practicing the same kind of sericulture as in China. This was by the 7th century. There's also lots of conjecture about Sogdia, which is roughly present-day Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan today in the world is number 3 in silk production, even though it falls hugely behind China, which is the number 1 producer, and India, which is the number 2. And so the same scholar, Gang Wu, states that there's no real evidence of contemporary sericulture in Sogdiana itself, but rather that they were weaving silk imported from China until much later. And his conjecture is that he deduced this by another excavation, which was in the town of Afrasiyab in Samarkand, where they excavated a royal dwelling, and the dwelling was full of these beautiful murals, many of them. And this mural is of Chinese envoys in the mid-7th century presenting the local king, Vakuman, with gifts. And the first one is carrying silk bales, the first 2, in fact. The third man is carrying silk yarn to be woven, and the last one is carrying silk cocoons. And so the scholars, Chinese scholars, deduce that actually Sogdiana wasn't producing silk at the time, so this was mid-7th century. And then he goes on to say actually silk production in Sogdiana probably only started after the Battle of Talas in AD 751. And the Battle of Talas was the battle between the Muslim Abbasid army coming from Iraq against the Chinese. So the Muslims were expanding eastwards, and they defeated the Chinese at Talas. They took many people prisoner back to Kufa in present-day Iraq. One of these people was a man called Du Huan, who spent 10 years in Kufa, a prisoner, but basically roaming freely around the country, after which he went back. And when he was in Kufa, he made many, many notes and records, which his cousin wrote up when he got back to China 10 years later. And one of them was that there were Chinese silk workers who had been taken captive and brought to Iraq. And so that the same scholar, plus his colleagues, conclude that it's probably only after the Battle of Talas that sericulture moved into Sogdiana and into other parts of the Middle East, including Persia. Some people claim sericulture started in Persia 2,000 years ago, but there's no real evidence for that. Weaving, yes, but not actual silk production. And this is when evidence starts of silk being produced in these regions. And one of them is a 9th century historian from Baghdad called al-Baladhuri, who wrote, that was the Battle of Talas, who wrote this book, in Arabic, of course, but this is a translation, which I'm showing you here. And he mentions the production of silk in various places in the region. And by the 10th century, silkworm farming and production was very clearly documented in other Muslim geographers' work, including al-Islammiyah, who actually drew this world map. Once the Muslims had conquered Mesopotamia, so this is a beautiful piece of lampas silk from 12th century Baghdad, they started to combine and consolidate methods and technologies and improving them and taking them to other places. And there were existing industries, for example, in silk in places like Mosul, which in pre-Islamic times was near Nineveh. where there was a long-established textile industry, including a silk weaving industry. But by the time the Abbasids had taken control in Kufa, the guilds, formal guilds were being developed and improved with a clear structure. So heads of guilds were appointed by the government, and amongst these was the head of the Guild of Silk Production. Silk produced in Iraq at the time fetched huge prices, and so the Abbasids introduced silk weaving into other cities such as Basra. And in order to encourage people to wear silk and to buy silk, the senior officials would wear it. Such was the case with the official shown in this Sasanian-style coin called Ziad ibn Abihi, who was a one-time governor of Basra, governor of Iraq, and he promoted the silk industry in Basra by wearing the locally produced silk. Also, the royalty all around the Middle East wanted silk, so the Umayyad Caliph, Suleiman ibn Malik, this is a coin minted in his reign. We have quite a collection of these coins in the museum. He was fond of the light silk that came from Kufa, and so this was procured and sent to him from to Damascus. At the time, there was a pre-Islamic Arab kingdom called al-Hira, and which these are the ruins, damaged, of course, by ISIS. And this was the kingdom of the Lakhmids, which was in turn a vassal kingdom of the Sasanian Empire. And they had a very famous textile industry at the time, which expanded greatly once Muslim rule became established. Another important city, as I said, was Mosul, called Pearl of the North, mentioned by Marco Polo himself, who said that all the cloths of gold and silk that are called muslins are made in this country. And he wrote a long tract about silk from Mosul. The word muslin today in English, which refers to a light cotton fabric, comes from the French term mousseline, which in turn comes from the city of Mosul itself. And while muslin today is known as a cotton fabric, originally it referred to a very light silk fabric that was made in Mosul, such as the one I showed you a little earlier. Along with this, there are several other kinds of silks made in Mosul, such as heavier silks used for curtains and furnishings, brocades, silk and gold thread woven through. It was also made in Kufa, as I said, and the industry there was established in the 8th century, a major weaving center. Baghdad was also known for a thick, silky fabric like velvet. And there was yet another fabric woven from silk mixed with cotton in Baghdad from a neighborhood called al-Athar, which became very famous and sought after in Europe. And once it had reached Spain, it started to be called Atabi, and then it passed on into France, where it became Tabi, and then it reached England, where it was called Tabi. And this was a striped taffeta style of silk, and the word exists today in this. Oh, see, I've been missing my slides, haven't I? Sorry. This is the Atabiya type silk. This is not from Iraq, it's actually from Yemen. And yeah, I was supposed to go along with slides, I forgot. That's a Tabi cat. I thought you'd like it. So this cat takes its name from Tabi silk from Baghdad. Today, of course, the silk is referred to as moire. That's the contemporary name for that type of silk. It's this sort of style of silk that was being made. This was fashionable in England in the 16th century, and Queen Elizabeth I was said to have gowns made of this. And also Samuel Pepys, the English diarist writing in the 17th century, mentioned Tabi silk, including his waistcoat, coat, and his wife's gowns. More recently, it was mentioned in the Arab press, and specifically in the Syrian press, that Queen Elizabeth II's wedding dress was made of Syrian moire, which is actually, I mean, if you Google it, you'll still find newspaper and magazine articles saying that this silk was given to Queen Elizabeth for her wedding, and she made a wedding dress out of it. And while she was offered Syrian silk, it didn't become her wedding dress, which was actually Syrian silk, English silk, sorry. So I thought I'd show you a picture of the dress, which is, as you can see, satin silk rather than moire. In Iran, silk production started before the 8th century, although there are undocumented claims for its existence several centuries before that. Weaving, of course, was established, as it was elsewhere, first with imported Chinese yarn. But over the centuries, of course, there were rises and dips in the local industry, and while a lot of the silk produced in the early Safavid period was being exported to Europe through the Ottoman Empire, there was a huge tax levied before the silk could be passed on to the Venetians and the Genoans who took it into Europe. So that was a problem for Europe at the time. But with the development of the silk industry under Islamic rule, there was a rise, yet again another rise in demand for silk from this region. And the demand was by royals, by churches too. And in the early days, the import of silk was controlled through a guild in Constantinople, whose premise it was to deal exclusively with silks from Syria, mainly, but also from Iraq. And any silk going to Europe had to pass through this guild. But once the Crusader kingdoms were established, of course, the Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice were able to circumvent the Byzantines and take it directly to Europe without paying the huge taxes to Constantinople. Early in the 8th century, the Arabs took sericulture as well as silk weaving to newly conquered parts of the Islamic world, including North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. And once the Iberian Peninsula came under their control in 711 AD and Al-Andalus became established there, they brought mulberry trees as well as silkworms, and they established a silk production and weaving industry which is famed to this day. And they did have silk before that, but that was being imported from Constantinople, as I said. And by the 10th century, the rearing of silkworms in Spain and the production and weaving of silk had become very firmly established. And Córdoba, the center of government, was the preeminent silk production center in Spain, as well as the production of a textile called Tiras, which I'll explain shortly. I'll just take you through the slides and show you some of the silks. So Tiras was woven all over the Muslim world, which I'll explain shortly. These are samples of textiles woven in Spain at the time, and which went into ecclesiastical or royal European collections. This is a detail. Here you have a very famous curtain which was woven in Almeria for the Alhambra Palace in Granada, and which was, of course, taken as booty in 1492 when the last Muslim kingdom was overthrown. It's got beautiful embroidery on the bottom, including in script. And then I was going to talk a little about tiras. So tiras is a type of fabric, very often in silk, but not exclusively, but the more important ones were silk, which had a writing embroidered into them. And you can see it in this miniature here by al-Hariri. They're all wearing robes with tirabs on the borders. And the tiras was so important that it was used as a currency. So as well as collecting gold, people would collect tiras. If they were awarded with tiras by a king or a sultan or an emperor, they'd keep it as wealth, basically. And tiras, of course, hasn't always been of script, but it's a specifically Islamic period thing, and it became the most common form. when it mentions the king, of course, or the ruler, it became even more precious, and the ruler would often present it to high officials, again, who would keep them as investments. That one mentions a sultan. I just showed this because this is a robe, which is called khila in Arabic, and presenting robes, I had a long spiel about it here. So presenting robes is like presenting a medal in other parts of the world. So as in England you'd present an honorific title or an award such as an MBE, in early Muslim times and until the later Muslim periods, they would present robes with tiras on them, such as this one. And these would be extremely valuable. And Ibn Battuta, the great Arab traveler, traveled all around these regions, and in each place he was presented with a tiras, and so he actually managed to amass quite a large collection of khila, the robes. This is the Robe of the Prophet, which was reportedly donated by the Prophet himself to someone called Uwais ibn al-Qarni, and it was passed down through the family until the 16th century when the Ottomans took it to Istanbul, where it's presented once a year during Ramadan. Silk mixed with linen and wool. And this is a ceremony which was very formal during the Abbasid period of presenting honorific robes to people, mostly of silk embroidered with gold, with tiras, of course. I was going to talk about the Normans and their adoption of the Arab style of life. That's King Roger II who founded it. This is the mantle of Roger II, and it was woven for his coronation by Arab silk workers with locally made Sicilian silk, embroidered with gold, of course, and with Gulf pearls, which is very interesting. And the symbolism in there is the Norman lions conquering the Arab camels. And this went into the collection of the Holy Roman Empire as well. So I was going to talk about silk in our museum, and I was going to mention, this is not the Islamic world, but because China is the birthplace of silk, and we have quite an impressive collection of Chinese dragon robes in the museum, and dragon robes were robes worn by the imperial family, full of symbolism. For example, in a dragon robe, if it had 5 claws, it could only be worn by the emperor, the empress, or the crown prince. And so, I mean, this is a study in itself. You could talk for hours about this. So we have a nice collection of Chinese robes, not on display, although we've recently put one out, which anyone who visits the museum after we reopen it in a couple of weeks' time, you'll be able to see. I also was going to talk a little about Persia. We've got quite a large collection of Persian textiles, lampas, which is the type of silk where you've got a pattern on the front, but on the back it's just a mass of threads. It's a very special type of silk weaving, which looks similar to brocade, but brocade, if you look on the back, you can see the pattern that you see on the front. So this is all Safavid lampas from the museum's collection. A brocade jacket from Persian. The Persian ones are all Safavid period. Sorry to rush through these. As I said, next time I'll start from the back. And then we have these beautiful Ottoman silks too. First from plain silks like this, woven with gold, to this rather European style satin. This was quite popular in the early 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, and studded with gems, of course. These are different silk weaves. We've got a lot of these very, very heavily embroidered gowns, which incidentally they also used in Syria as well. and plus other styles of... I mentioned Iznik because the patterns which the Ottomans were experimenting with went into the weaving as well as into their famous Iznik pottery. And I showed you this banner because the Ottomans made these very, very large silk banners which they took into war, and if they were defeated, such as in this case during the siege of Vienna, in 1683, it would be kept as booty. And we have a similar one in the museum. I couldn't get a very good picture of it because it's on display and we couldn't find a photograph. We looked everywhere. It's very large silk. And this one I just put for fun because it's a barber's robe from the Ottoman Empire. So if you went to cut your hair, they'd put this over you. A very posh barber's robe. We have some beautiful things from Syria, many. This is very classical Syrian style, more early 20th century, and Central Asia, which of course is also another fascinating area. And hopefully you'll be able to see some of these. And then just quickly, at the end, Morocco. I was going to describe this specific... This robe is very, very heavy because it's woven with gold. And finally, just I was going to show you all the holy silks from various religious sites, which I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Calligraphy Museum. You probably would have seen there. And I think I should end there because it's been 1 hour.